My wife erased me from her life the moment she received a massive inheritance. 5 years later, she found me, desperate and financially ruined, only to realize the 300 calls she made were never answered. My name is Robert, and this is the story of how my marriage crumbled the moment money entered the picture. It all began the day Claire, my then wife, received a call early in the morning. It was a rainy Wednesday. I was finishing breakfast when I heard her answer the phone with the theatricality that usually accompanied important conversations. She put it on speaker, and the voice of Rose, her aunt, filled the kitchen. Her tone was broken, and it didn't take much to understand why. Grandmother Carmela had passed away, and she had left absolutely everything to Claire, an inheritance so large it could literally transform anyone's life. Initially, I felt a confused mix of sadness for her loss and relief that Carmela had wanted to secure her future. I approached and put my hand on her shoulder, thinking we would face this together, as always. But as soon as she hung up, her expression changed, almost imperceptibly. I didn't see grief, surprise, or even gratitude. It was something else, something I couldn't identify right away. "Can you believe it?" she finally murmured. Her tone was not of disbelief, but of calculation. And at that moment, I had the unsettling feeling that something inside her was shifting, as if she had found a door she had been waiting a long time to open. I tried to keep calm. "That's incredible, darling. She must have loved you very much to leave you all this." She nodded vaguely, but the look she gave me was different from any other she had directed at me in our marriage. She no longer saw me as her partner, but as something else, something I didn't define until later. "You know what this means, right?" she said, moving closer to the window to watch the rain fall. "I don't have to worry about anything anymore. No more limits, no more budget, no more giving things up." Her words hit me with the force of a punch to the stomach. We had never been rich, but we lived well. I worked to cover our bills, the mortgage, groceries, the essentials, and the extras. We had a comfortable middle-class life. What sacrifices was she seeing that I wasn't? The following days were filled with calls, meetings with lawyers, and financial advisors. I tried to help her, even offering to organize documents and review details. But she bluntly refused me. "I can handle it myself," she said. "It's not that complicated." I accepted it because, after all, it was her inheritance. But soon, the subtle comments began, revealing a crack that hadn't been there before. She looked at the house with a mix of disdain and annoyance. "These furnishings have always been too simple," she would say in passing. Or she would browse streaming platforms and sigh, "Soon we can have better things." She seemed convinced that our life had been a kind of modest prison from which she had finally been freed. The real breaking point came a couple of weeks later, during a dinner with a couple of friends we had known for years. The conversation inevitably turned to the inheritance. It was impossible to keep something like that a secret in such a small social circle. "It must be a huge relief," our friend commented. "Financial security is always a blessing." Claire smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. There was something sharp in that expression. "Yes, it makes you see things differently, people too." And as she uttered those words, she looked directly at me. My friend frowned, noticing the dense atmosphere at the table. "What do you mean?" Claire set down her glass with exaggerated precision. "When you no longer depend on someone else's income, you start to see what things were necessary and what were simply choices." I felt my stomach sink. I clenched my jaw. "Necessary?" I asked, trying not to lose my composure. She shrugged. "How many decisions in our life together were made based on your salary? Where we lived, what we could buy, what we did on weekends? Now I can choose what I want without having to adapt to what you can afford." Our friends looked away uncomfortably. I had to get up to go to the bathroom, more to compose myself than out of true necessity. When I returned, they had changed the subject, but the damage was done. Claire, without any disguise, had reduced all our years of marriage to a system of economic convenience. The drive home was silent. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, trying to process what I had just heard. I remembered when I worked extra hours to buy her a special gift. When she said she felt protected because I took care of our home. When she spoke proudly of my promotions and my responsibility. All of that had just been necessity. 3 weeks later, The inheritance money was deposited into her account. That same day, she left the house saying she wanted to clear her head a bit. I thought she was going to make some practical purchase, but she returned with several bags from stores I had never seen her enter. Each piece of clothing had a tag whose price made me swallow hard. When she saw my face, she blurted out a sentence that sounded more defensive than calm. "Don't look at me like that. Can't I afford this now?" "I'm not looking at you in any way," I replied. "I'm just surprised by this sudden shopping spree." She laughed, but it wasn't her usual laugh. It was a high-pitched, almost mocking laugh. She explained that she had wanted those kinds of things for years, but before, she couldn't justify them. When she said that, she emphasized couldn't in a way that made me understand she was referring to my salary, to our previous limitations. That night, she tried on all the clothes, twirling in front of the mirror with an enthusiasm that she seemingly shared with me, but which was not really for me. I saw it clearly in her eyes. She wasn't showing off for my benefit, but to emphasize what she could now do without depending on me. "What do you think?" she asked, modeling a dress that surely cost more than what I earned in a week. "You look beautiful," I told her sincerely. "You always have." Her smile instantly faded. That wasn't the recognition she was looking for. She wanted me to admit that she no longer needed my financial support, that our dynamic had completely changed. I understood it, though at that moment I didn't know what to do about it. Her transformation accelerated in a way I never imagined. A month after receiving the money, Claire was a different person. She traded her old car for a sports convertible that cost as much as many people's annual salary. When I asked about the insurance, she laughed. "Insurance, Robert? I don't have to think about those things anymore." Then came the house. One day I returned from work and found strangers moving furniture while Claire, wineglass in hand, supervised everything with an expert air. She had hired interior designers, bought custom furniture, and hung art on the walls accompanied by certificates of authenticity. "Isn't it wonderful?" she said, pointing to an abstract painting that looked more like an accident than a work of art. What we had before was memories, photos of our trips, books we read together, furniture we chose as a couple, our life. Now everything looked like it was taken from a magazine about rich, identityless people. But the truly difficult part wasn't the material change, but the way she started treating me. She organized elegant dinners, inviting people we barely knew, except that they belonged to the right social circles. I would come home and find chefs preparing appetizers, waiters setting up glasses, and my wife dressed as if she were going to a gala. "Oh, there you are," she would say, as if I were interrupting my own home. "Don't you want to take a shower and change? Important people will be arriving." Those important people were never our friends. They were hers, or rather, the ones who interested her now. During these gatherings, she introduced me with a mixture of disdain and superiority. "This is my husband. He works in—" what was it called? Something about systems management, as if my job were an unimportant hobby. One evening, a man in an expensive suit asked me what I did. Before I could open my mouth, Claire jumped in. "He has one of those stable, practical jobs," she said, using a tone that sounded more like condescension than praise. "Very functional." They smiled, nodded, and went back to commenting on their art collection. I would leave early, justifying it by saying I had to get up early. Claire barely looked up to say goodbye. It became a habit for her to organize gatherings without consulting me. Then she would get irritated because I didn't enthusiastically participate in conversations about yacht clubs, exclusive tastings, and social circles that had no relevance to me. "You're being antisocial," she reproached me one night. "These people could be a good connection for us." "Connections for what?" I asked, exasperated. "We already have friends, and I have a job." She looked at me as if she didn't understand life at all. "Robert, don't you see? This is our chance to move up, to surround ourselves with successful people, not to—" She made a vague gesture toward the neighborhood where our old acquaintances lived. "Settle for the mediocre." I knew then that the distance between us no longer had to do with money. It was something deeper. Claire was no longer looking for a life with me, but a new identity in which I barely fit. And although I tried to convince myself that this phase would pass, deep down I already knew that the person I had loved was vanishing behind a mask of luxury, pretense, and resentment. I always knew Claire considered our life together insufficient, but I never imagined the depth of her discontent until that Saturday morning at the end of November. I was in the kitchen calmly making coffee as part of our usual routine when I heard her firm footsteps. She entered fully dressed, as if she had an unmissable business meeting. "I'm going to lunch with some women from the country club," she announced while smoothing her hair using her phone camera. She added a comment about strategic positions on charitable boards, as if we were discussing high-level meetings. I replied with a simple "good," but inside I wondered since when she was even part of a country club. "They are people who can open doors," she clarified. "Real doors?" I asked. She stopped, looking me up and down. I was wearing jeans and a casual shirt, with the coffee maker bubbling next to me. "It's not exactly the life where the most exciting thing about the weekend is making coffee on a Saturday morning." I gently placed the cup on the counter. "And what's wrong with enjoying a coffee at home on a Saturday morning?" She sighed, that long, dramatic sigh she always used when she wanted to imply that I was an incomprehensible obstacle in her path. "Nothing, if one settles for small things," she replied, "if one doesn't aspire to anything more." I stayed silent. I lowered my voice when I spoke. "I thought you were happy with this." "I thought so too," she said. "But that was before I discovered what true happiness is." She picked up her bag, checked her appearance again, and before leaving the kitchen added, "You know what I realized yesterday? That I've spent years making decisions based on what we could afford. Where to travel, what car to buy, whether we could ever afford to dine out during the week, always adjusting to a limit. But you simply lived within your means. You didn't give anything up. I did." And she left. I stayed sitting in that kitchen, or her kitchen as it felt at that moment, trying to understand how we had gotten here. I remembered the woman who surprised me with homemade dinners for no reason, the one who said her favorite moments were Sunday mornings, without plans, without hurry. Now, those very moments were proof to her of a small, mediocre life. The following Tuesday, the inevitable happened. When I arrived home from work, I found her sitting in the living room with a glass of wine and a brown folder on the coffee table. "We need to talk," she said. I knew what was inside that folder. "I've been thinking about us," she continued, with a tone that sounded more like a work meeting than a marital conversation. "And I think we are looking for different things, very different things." I didn't sit down. I remained standing. She took a deep breath and let it out. "I think we should get a divorce." The words didn't surprise me, but I still felt the blow in my stomach. I simply replied, "I understand." My calm reaction seemed to disconcert her. I think she expected pleading, an argument, some gesture that showed desperation. "I've already spoken with a lawyer," she added, opening the folder and spreading out official documents. "I want everything to be clean, without drama." Clean, I thought, as if there was a truly fair way to dissolve a marriage where one person decides the other no longer fits into their new life. I glanced over the papers. Dissolution, division of assets, all perfectly squared. "I'll keep the house," she said. "It's the most logical thing, and my inheritance from Carmela remains separate property, so it doesn't factor in here. But for the rest, you will get your fair share." Your fair share. What a generous favor. I turned to the last page. Her signature was already stamped, firm and confident, as if she had decided this long ago. She asked, "Do you have any questions?" I had too many. When did I stop being enough? Did she ever truly love me? Or was I simply a form of stability? But I said nothing. I picked up the pen and signed every sheet without arguing, without calling a lawyer, without asking for time. When I finished, her eyes widened slightly in surprise. "That's it?" she asked. "That's it," I replied, handing the folder back. I walked to the entrance, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" she asked from behind me. "To leave," I replied without looking back. As I drove away, I saw her in the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway of our house, watching me go. Her expression was a mix of bewilderment and frustration. Perhaps she expected tears, pleas, or a promise to become the kind of man her new economic standard required. For years, I lived with the constant feeling, though I never said it aloud, that for certain people, I was nothing more than a temporary resource, a momentary support they could use as long as it was convenient. And when I stopped being useful, when I stopped fitting the mold they had built of me, I almost inevitably became just another disappointment they could cross off their list. With Claire, That idea finally became a daily pang that dug deeper and deeper. The accumulation of small gestures, calculated silences, demands disguised as normality, and impossible expectations finally culminated in a day when I knew I didn't want to go back to that house. I remember exactly the feeling that washed over my chest when I closed the door behind me. It was as if I had released a gigantic weight that I had been dragging for years without realizing it. I didn't go back that night, or the next, or the one after. In fact, many days passed before I set foot there again, and by then, I wasn't going as a husband, but as a visitor collecting the little that was left. I checked into a downtown hotel, a discreet building with quiet hallways and service that asked no questions. Exactly what I needed. Anonymity. I didn't want explanations, pitying looks, or uncomfortable conversations. In that impersonal room, with the air conditioning humming in the background, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the silence take over. It was the first time in months, maybe years, that my mind was clear enough to face the truth without excuses. I didn't call lawyers or ask friends for advice, nor did I turn to family who surely would have tried to convince me to talk to Claire, to work it out, to try one more time. Instead, I dialed the number of a company specializing in corporate relocations. It was the first step in a plan I had been postponing for too long. How quickly can a relocation to another state be organized? I asked, with a firmness I didn't remember having before. The manager paused for a few seconds, as if evaluating whether he was speaking to someone desperate or simply determined. "It depends on the position and the company," he finally replied. "Do you have a deadline?" 2 weeks, I replied without hesitation. "Ambitious," he said with a tone that mixed surprise and professionalism, "but possible. Do you have an area in mind?" Minneapolis, Denver, Phoenix. Any of those cities was as valid as any other, as long as it was far from where my life had been until that moment. And so, 3 days later, I had interviews scheduled. I didn't sleep well during those days, but not because of anxiety, but because of the energy that appears when one is about to make a complete change in their life. Less than a week later, I received a formal offer from Minneapolis. The position was not only good, it represented a real promotion. The salary exceeded my previous one by 15%. To top it off, the company covered all moving expenses. That detail sealed the decision. There was nothing to think about. It was the exit I had been waiting for years without recognizing it. I returned to the house only once, on a Thursday afternoon, at the exact time I knew Claire would be at her spa routine. That detail, which might seem irrelevant, was one more sign of how predictable our life had become. I entered without haste, without fear of running into her, and what I found when I crossed the threshold confirmed that I no longer belonged there. The atmosphere was different. New artwork hung on the walls, furniture slightly rearranged, fresh flowers in vases I had never seen. It was as if she had tried to erase any trace of our shared history to replace it with an aesthetic more in line with what she had always wanted to project outwardly. I packed only the essentials, my documents, a few changes of clothes, my favorite books. I didn't even consider taking the objects we had bought together. I didn't want to carry memories that were actually illusions disguised as stability. I left behind tools, appliances, furniture, even photographs that at one time represented a promise that was never fulfilled. The images of our wedding were still neatly arranged on the fireplace mantel. It was strange to see them there, intact, as if they belonged to someone else's life. The furniture was in its exact place, the kitchen impeccable, my toolbox in the garage just as I had left it. Everything was the same. And yet nothing belonged to me. I didn't leave a note or a message. I didn't apologize or justify anything. I just took my wedding ring, placed it on the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker she used every morning, and left. I knew she would see it and understand my silence. The move to Minneapolis was completed even faster than anticipated. The company managed everything with surprising efficiency. 2 weeks after signing the divorce papers, I was in an empty but bright apartment more than 200 miles away from my old life, watching the moving truck pull away down the street until it disappeared. I closed the door, leaned my forehead against the wood, took a deep breath, and knew it was the real beginning of something new. I immersed myself in work with an almost obsessive dedication, memorizing names, understanding the internal workings of the company, identifying the rhythms of each department. Every task contributed to a sense of progress. I joined a nearby gym. I explored the streets to find my favorite coffee shop. I established new routines without looking back. I changed my phone number the same day I arrived. I closed my social media accounts and opened new ones with a slight pseudonym. I wasn't looking to disappear, but I also wasn't willing for anyone to drag me back to a life I no longer wanted. Francis, the only friend I still had from college, got my work number after repeatedly insisting at the company. When we finally spoke, his first sentence was so absurd it took me a moment to process it. "Claire is preparing a party," he told me. "Seriously? A party this weekend. She's calling it the celebration of the new chapter." She had invited acquaintances, family, colleagues, people who were once part of our life together, a party to celebrate that I was no longer there. "Are you okay?" Francis asked, sincere, incredulous. "No one understands what happened between you two." "I'm fine," I replied. "Better than ever." And it was true. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in a long time. No interruptions, no repetitive thoughts, no anxiety. Days later, I learned how the party had been. A senseless extravagance, an exaggerated buffet, a professional DJ, an open bar that looked more like an ostentatious competition than a social event. Everything corresponded exactly to the kind of celebration where style outweighs meaning. But the most revealing thing was learning about Claire's attitude throughout the evening. According to several attendees, she kept looking at the door every time someone entered. She checked her phone constantly, as if waiting for a call that never came. She made calculated comments aloud. Some people don't know how to face change. They prefer to disappear rather than accept reality. She even insinuated that I would show up at any moment to ask her to reconsider everything, convinced that I couldn't live without her. Meanwhile, I was assembling furniture in my new apartment, studying hiking trails, and choosing which plants I wanted to put in the living room. 2 states away, 2 completely different lives. The attempts at contact began on Sunday. Claire called my old number again and again. Francis, who still had access to certain circles, told me that at first the messages were pure rage. Later, they transformed into desperate questions. "Where are you?" was the first, almost a written scream. Then, when she got no response, she started looking for me in all the places I used to frequent. My old gym, our favorite coffee shop, even my job. There, she learned that I had resigned days ago and that my office was empty, without a single object to reveal who had worked there. During the first few days, Claire didn't understand that I was truly gone. She thought I was hiding at a friend's house or had taken refuge in a hotel for a couple of nights to make her anxious. But I hadn't left. I had decided to disappear completely from everything we shared. Within 2 weeks of not being able to locate me, she ended up hiring a private investigator. I later learned, almost by chance, that the investigator's report indicated that I had erased my tracks like a professional. New job, new address, different phone number, routines totally unrelated to the ones she knew. But that was much later. At that moment, I was only focused on building a different life from the ground up, without the shadow of my marriage hanging over me. The first few months were a profound transition. I joined a hiking group and spent many weekends exploring rural trails in nearby towns. I took a cooking class, more out of necessity than hobby, and ended up surprising myself by preparing dishes that didn't come from an ATM or a fast food restaurant. I also took up reading again, something I had abandoned in the last years of the relationship with Claire. I started buying furniture that truly suited me, not what pretended to be luxurious: a comfortable armchair, a mattress that allowed me to sleep well, a kitchen table from which I could have breakfast looking at the trees in the small yard. The most important thing was that I stopped living dependent on someone else. I stopped analyzing every gesture, every silence, every possible sign of her displeasure. I stopped wondering what she might be thinking or planning, and above all, I stopped caring if Claire would miss what I had contributed, or if she would regret anything. Over time, I discovered that she assumed I would return in a month. She apparently said I was overreacting and would soon come to my senses, that life would hit me with its reality, and I would return, remorseful. That's why she kept the house intact for half a year, as if my absence were a simple tantrum. But I wasn't acting or trying to teach her a lesson. It wasn't a demonstration. It was exhaustion. Exhaustion from always being someone's second choice. Exhaustion from being the functional alternative in a life she labeled as mediocre. Exhaustion from participating in a project that never considered me good enough. By the time my first winter in Minneapolis arrived, I had routines completely detached from my past. I had found new friends who knew me as Robert, not as Claire's husband. I discovered the pleasure of quiet Saturday mornings, but now because I chose them, not because I couldn't afford anything else. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was building something that was solely mine, and that was enough. 3 years later, when my life was already organized and calm, I received an unexpected call. It was Neil, our former neighbor. He was never a close friend, but there was always cordiality. Hearing him on the other end disconcerted me. "I hope I'm not bothering you with this call," he said after some formal greetings. "I got your number through your old company directory. I wasn't sure if I should contact you." "Can you tell me what's going on?" I replied, intrigued. "It's about Claire," he added, measuring every word. "I don't know if you're still in contact or if you're interested in knowing, but things have gotten very complicated for her lately." I kept silent for a few seconds. A part of me was curious. Another part, the more settled and conscious one, no longer wanted to deal with that. "Complicated in what sense?" I finally asked. He sighed before continuing. "She lost the house last month to foreclosure. I think she's temporarily living with her parents." That took me by surprise. The house had been fully paid off after the divorce. "How do you lose a house that doesn't have a mortgage?" I murmured. "She took out a loan using the property as collateral about 18 months ago," he explained. "A large loan. Then she couldn't keep up with the payments." For the next 20 minutes, he recounted everything that had happened with the life I had distanced myself from. What he described was simultaneously surprising and completely predictable. He told me that expenses had multiplied. Designer clothes stopped being an occasional whim and became the norm. She traded her BMW for a Mercedes and then for a Porsche. She traveled to Europe several times, bought jewelry that exceeded the value of many cars, and renovated the house twice in barely 2 years. She also organized huge parties every few weeks with professional decor, catering, music, and everything that could attract attention. Apparently, she was trying to get into some exclusive social circle, but the cost was astronomical. When her grandmother Carmela's inheritance money began to run out, she took out the loan, hoping, he said, to maintain her lifestyle while figuring out her next step. But the payments were too high, and she had no stable income. The idea of her working was absurd for someone who had lived so long, convinced she had unlimited resources. She tried looking for a job 6 months ago, but she had been out of the market for too long, and her expectations were ridiculous. She wanted executive positions without current experience. When that didn't work, she tried to open a consultancy, though it never got past the initial phase. The math, however harsh, was simple. Even the largest inheritance has a limit, and that limit arrives quickly when one spends as if it were infinite, and there is nothing to replenish what is consumed. The sale of the house didn't even cover what she owed. The loan, credit cards, and all the renovations and decorations added during those years. She left with nothing, absolutely nothing. The same woman who once described our life as a mediocre middle-class existence was now starting from scratch with less than we had the day we got married. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," Neil admitted, "but she's been insisting for days. She asks about you, where you are, if anyone has your contact. I think reality is finally hitting her." After hearing that, I stood for a long time in my apartment kitchen in Minneapolis, trying to process everything I had just heard, and the strange thing is, I felt nothing. No relief, no satisfaction, no hatred, no pity, nothing. I had built a new life far from her. I had been promoted twice at work and was earning more than I ever imagined. I bought a cabin an hour north of the city where I spent weekends reading, hiking the trails, and enjoying the profound silence. The very silence Claire used to call ordinary or mediocre. And most importantly, I had started dating again. It wasn't formal yet, but I knew women who valued the simple way I lived, and who never tried to change me or escape from who we were. The conversation with Neil brought up a thought I had almost buried: the enormous amount of energy I spent trying to be enough for someone who never believed I was in the first place. 2 months later, I received another call, this time from Francis, a college friend I hadn't heard from in a while. "Robert, this is going to sound crazy," he told me, "but I think your ex tried to contact me on Facebook. She sent me a message asking if I knew how to find you. According to her, it's urgent." "And what did you do?" I asked. "Nothing. I ignored it." But her tone was desperate. She said she made mistakes and wants to fix things. She also mentioned that she tried calling your old number and it's disconnected. It looks like she's been looking for you for a long time. I paused, deep in thought. I remembered the woman I married and compared her to the woman who one day, without batting an eye, put divorce papers in front of me because I didn't fit the standard of living she claimed to deserve. Sometimes I wondered which version truly represented Claire, though I soon understood that it no longer mattered. My decision had been made the moment I signed the divorce and disappeared from her circle. I chose to rebuild myself instead of fighting for someone who had decided I wasn't worth the effort. 6 months later, the stories reaching me about her began to repeat. Friends and acquaintances called me to say that Claire was asking about me, looking for people we had been in contact with in the past, and even writing to people she barely knew, all with the intention of finding my whereabouts. She sounds desperate, one of them told me. Not just for money, although that's part of the problem. It's like she's emotionally broken, as if she finally understands what she lost. It was a curious way to describe it. According to those accounts, Claire spent almost 2 years trying to sustain the lifestyle she believed she deserved. She burned through money, favors, and connections at an incredible speed. The friends from the sophisticated circle disappeared when she stopped being useful. The group of acquaintances she boasted so much about moved on to someone with more resources. In the end, she was left alone, without stability or support, and apparently began to understand that financial security is not the same as human connection. But that was a lesson for her to learn alone. It was not my task or my responsibility. I had already learned mine. Sometimes the greatest display of self-love is walking away from someone who doesn't value what you bring to the table. And I had internalized it so deeply that even the news of her desperation didn't awaken in me the impulse to save her from the consequences of her own decisions. Some people spend years trying to find themselves. I found myself the day I let go of someone who never wanted to know who I really was. 5 years after the divorce, I was living a life I never would have imagined. My house was fully paid for. I had been promoted to senior manager, and I was in a stable relationship with Eleanor, a woman who appreciated quiet mornings as much as I did. One Tuesday afternoon, while working in the office, my phone rang. "Robert?" an unfamiliar voice asked. "Are you the one who used to live in Sacramento?" The man introduced himself as Sal Moreno, a private investigator. His tone was professional, firm, and to the point. "Depends on who's asking," I replied. "Your ex-wife hired me to locate you," he informed me. "She's been looking for you for a while. She also wants you to know something else," Sal added. "The phone company kept the records of what was your number. Even after it was disconnected, we found more than 300 missed calls made to that phone over 5 years. 5 years of calling a number she knew would eventually cease to exist. For 5 years, nearly 300 communications accumulated, all directed to the same number I abandoned the exact day I decided to disappear from Claire's life. That phone was a dead vestige, a definitively severed thread, yet she insisted repeatedly. More than one call per week, always ignored, always falling into a voicemail box I never checked again. It wasn't until I spoke with Sal that I had a real picture of what had been happening all that time. He didn't waste a second with pleasantries. "She wants to find you," he said with the serious voice of someone who had witnessed too many similar situations. "She's willing to travel wherever you are." At first, I thought it would be another exaggeration on her part, an attempt to pressure or generate some kind of emotional reaction. But Sal wasn't like that. The man had a particular tact for complicated cases, and a refined intuition after years of dealing with broken, remorseful people determined to chase shadows of the past. So, I asked for details. I needed to understand why, after so much silence, she would decide to move that way. "Claire can pay for the flight," he explained, "but everything else is impossible for her. She's financially destroyed." That immediately surprised me. Knowing her, it was difficult to imagine her facing material hardship. I asked him to be specific, and after a brief silence, he dropped the unvarnished truth. "She's completely broken, Robert," he said. "She truly has absolutely nothing. She's living with her parents again, in the same room she slept in at 17. She works at a big store doing impossible shifts, and she can't even afford to pay my fees. The person covering my expenses is Dominic, her cousin. He was the one who insisted on a more thorough investigation." It was shocking. A woman who had gone from thoughtless spending to depending on the goodwill of a relative. She lost everything, and she, accustomed to a life of appearances and economic stability, had ended up reduced to a point she never would have thought possible. And yet, after 5 years of absolute distance, she still intended to speak with me. Sal continued, as if preparing to give me the most delicate part. She's convinced she needs to apologize. She says she made terrible mistakes, that she only now understands what things were truly important, that she carries guilt that won't let her sleep. She talks about remorse, about wanting to repair whatever she can repair. It's typical of what many people say, but honestly, it sounds genuine. I listened, but my answer was clear from the start. I told him I would think about it, although the truth was that I had already decided. That chapter of my life had closed the same day I left the house we shared for the last time. Any kind of closure Claire needed was her business, not mine. That same night I called Sal and confirmed what we both knew from the beginning. I had no interest in seeing her. I figured, he replied before hanging up. She asked me to tell you something. She'll understand if you decide not to show up, but she'll be in Minneapolis this weekend anyway. She says she'll wait for you at that coffee shop in Granville you always went to. That part made my blood run a little cold. How much does she know about my current life exactly? I asked. There was a brief but evident pause. More than she should, he finally admitted. She knows your address, your job, the gym you go to. She's been following your movements for months. I only formalized the investigation when they hired me. She already had plenty of information on her own. Perfect. My ex-wife, observing my life from more than 200 miles away, every detail, every routine, without my having the slightest idea. Sal tried to calm the tone a bit. Robert, I've been in this business for 15 years. I've seen people fake repentance, lie through tears, manipulate with confessions. What she's expressing seems real. She doesn't want money. She doesn't want to get back together with you. She doesn't want to reopen anything. Just to explain what happened, ask for forgiveness, and, as she says, leave without bothering you if you don't show up. On Friday afternoon, on my way home from work, I drove past the coffee shop in Granville. I wasn't going to go in. I had no intention of seeking any kind of encounter. It was just a strange mix of curiosity and the need to confirm with my own eyes what 5 years of freefall looked like on someone who had once calmly called me mediocre. There was Claire, sitting by the window with a hunched posture I didn't recognize. She was a different person. There was no trace of the confident, elegant woman with that critical air she always had. Her clothes were simple, clean, but inexpensive. Nothing like the designer dresses that once filled her closet. Her face was pale, tired, aged prematurely. Her hair, pulled back in a graceless ponytail, showed how much her life had changed since the time she was obsessed with her image. She looked at her phone every few seconds and then at the door, as if waiting for me to appear at any moment. A mix of hope and anxiety was reflected in her expression. I observed her from the opposite sidewalk, 10 minutes that felt longer than they should have, and yes, a very small part of me felt compassion. But the other part, the one that had lived through everything, still perfectly remembered the feeling of being treated as a burden by someone who promised respect and commitment. I didn't cross the street, much less go in. I turned around and went straight home. Eleanor, my current girlfriend, was preparing dinner when I arrived and greeted me with that calm normalcy I had never had with Claire. At that moment, I knew I had nothing left pending with my ex. Seeing her waiting for a conversation I didn't intend to give her confirmed something I perhaps hadn't fully wanted to accept. During these 5 years I had moved forward, and she had simply fallen. The next morning, while making coffee and enjoying a quiet start to the weekend, the doorbell rang. I walked to the door with the still warm cup in my hand. When I looked through the peephole, I recognized her immediately. Claire was there standing at my door, and seeing her so close only reinforced the impression she had left on me the afternoon before. The wear and tear was greater, the desperation more evident, and the distance between who we were and who we were now abysmal. The confident, haughty attitude with which Claire had faced our divorce no longer existed. In its place, what I saw when I opened the door was a mixture of exhaustion, regret, and a kind of contained desperation. Still, I didn't invite her in. She stood on the threshold, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Hello," she murmured. "I know you didn't want to see me, but I felt I had to try one last time. I didn't return her greeting. I preferred to go straight to the point. How did you get my address? She lowered her gaze, ashamed. Sal told me. I'm sorry to show up like this, but I've been trying to contact you for 5 years. 5 years thinking about what I did, how I ruined everything. As she spoke, her gaze drifted toward the inside of the house, as if searching for signs of the life I had built without her. Are you okay? She asked suddenly, with a strange, almost timid tone. Are you happy? I didn't say yes, nor did I deny it. I simply waited for her to say what she had come to say after traveling more than 200 miles. I know I owe you nothing, she continued, her voice breaking. I know I have no right to be here, but I needed to tell you that I'm sorry. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I'm sorry for every word I said to you. I threw away the best part of my life and was too blind to see it. I replied with a simple, "It's okay." That gesture of calm seemed to disconcert her. She expected an explosion, an argument, perhaps a dramatic scene, but I was no longer in that place. I've lost everything, she confessed next. The money, the house, those supposed friends who only came around to take advantage. I work in a store, I live with my parents again, and every day I think about how things would have been if I hadn't been so selfish. She paused and added with a sincerity that almost seemed alien to the person I had known. I'm sorry you had to go through all of this. I truly regret it. I didn't know how to respond to her. She didn't expect anything from me, but I couldn't offer her something that no longer existed. I love you, she blurted out suddenly. I never stopped loving you. I got carried away by the money, by an absurd lifestyle, by the fantasy that I deserved something better when the best thing was right in front of me. It was the kind of declaration she seemed to have rehearsed 1,000 times in her head, her grand emotional finale, her last card. I appreciate you telling me, I replied without raising my voice, but that doesn't change anything. I saw her collapse as if she were crumbling inside. Please, I know I don't deserve you to try again, but we can start over. I'm a different person now. I understand what really matters. I shook my head slowly. You've changed because life forced you to change. Because you no longer have money or the lifestyle that made you feel superior. But that is not the same as truly transforming. It's not fair, she whispered. You may have learned something. Yes, I admit it. But I also grew. And the person I am now has no room in his life for someone who treated me the way you did. Tears began to fall. It wasn't exaggerated crying. They were brief sobs, like someone who finally runs out of escape. I know I hurt you, she said haltingly. I know I made you feel small, that I made you believe you weren't enough. But you were. You were everything. And I threw it away. You did, I nodded. And it wasn't a fit of rage. It wasn't a mistake in the moment. It was a cold decision, made with the conviction that your life should be different without me. She lifted her head, mascara streaking her cheeks. Then there's nothing I can say? Nothing I can do? No, I replied softly. We are over. I'm not angry anymore, but I'm also not available to relive something that died 5 years ago. Are you with someone? She asked, barely audible. Yes, with someone who values the life we share instead of seeing it as a stepping stone to something better. At that moment, I heard the garage door opening. Eleanor was coming back from her run. Claire tensed up. You have to leave, I told her firmly before Eleanor entered. And you must not come back. What was between us is finished. Accept that and move on with your life. She nodded as the tears began to fall again. She understood that this was the end. I hope someday you can forgive me, she murmured as she walked away. I already have, I replied. But forgiveness does not mean returning. When she finally disappeared from my sight, Eleanor walked up the sidewalk, breathing heavily. Who was that? She asked. No one important, I answered. And at that moment, I knew it was the truth. The woman who once occupied the center of my life no longer had any place in it. I had built something real, something solid. She, on the other hand, was still looking for someone to build a life to take refuge in. Everyone reaps what they sow.